Have you ever wondered why the rich are considered more privileged in school, even if they have the same personal problems? Malcolm Gladwell's podcast named Carlos Doesn't Remember uses creative elements to share this underrated issue in America's education system. Instead of your typical introductory interview, Gladwell starts the podcast with a clip of a later conversation with Carlos to show a glimpse of what's to come. This leaves the audience, listeners if you may, in suspense, wondering why his sophomore year in high school was his first year. Why wasn't school a challenge for him? What makes Carlos so different from the rest of us? Personally, it makes me want to continue listening to this podcast, if not for the content, then to figure out why is Carlos doing an interview? Why aren't I in an interview? As you listen on, trying to find the answers to these questions, you find yourself intrigued but not yet committed to finishing. However, every now and then Gladwell uses music that just makes you want to know more. After his media res about 15 seconds in, there is a thunderous melody, followed by music similar to that of a survival show. It is intense to say the least, but it draws you in to wonder what's coming next. In other words, it leaves you in suspense, adding a serious tone to the words. The addition of music makes the audience more engaged while adding sentiments, intensity, and tone to not only Gladwell's words, but to Eric's as well at the 29-minute mark where it makes the audience sadder to sympathize. This is also known as pathos, the rhetorical strategy of emotion. Not only does the podcast alternate between speaking and music, but it changes between narration and conversation as well. He uses narration to provide background information and context to the voices of Carlos, Eric, and others. Trying to tell someone's life story in a short amount of time can be tricky, so Gladwell uses his own narration to avoid complications with the voices of others. As you can tell, Carlos was nervous throughout this podcast, so the narration takes off some excess pressure to speak. It was used for clarification, time management, and to describe events to compensate for the lack of visual features. On the other hand, the other voices were used to add authenticity, to show the listeners that information is straight from the source. This is also known as ethos, the rhetorical strategy of credibility, since Gladwell uses not only the voices of the people involved, but the information from credible university sources. Speaking of ethos, the fact that Gladwell is a Canadian makes the entire podcast that much more credible, meaning he gives an unbiased, outside point of view. Local residents may give a more opinionated response to whether America is good at capitalization or not, making it more untrustworthy. His sincerity is evident because he never spoke from his own perspective, only through the stories of others affected. Gladwell uses the technique of suspense all throughout this constructive piece, through his use of music, media res, the title, and more. It pulls the listeners in, making them continue the podcast to discover the meaning of Carlos's story. Judging on my complete and utter interest throughout the whole piece, it is highly effective. Gladwell began with the question, is it true that Americans are good at capitalization? Through Carlos's story and the statistics, we've come to the conclusion that they are not. His information shows that many students' lives overrule their potential to succeed in higher colleges such as Harvard or Princeton. A family's financial situation plays a huge role. Even if we give a full-ride scholarship to students who deserve it, there are many factors that may hinder their opportunity to be like the rich kids. As Gladwell said, there's probably 35,000 students a year who score the 90th percentile or above on their SATs who also come from families living on less than $40,000 a year. This scientific research is used to persuade the audience towards believing in the true misfortune of students because it is concrete and unarguable, and such it is considered logos. The title of this podcast is Carlos Doesn't Remember. It is also a mini description of the reality of the lives in poor communities. It's not that Carlos physically cannot remember his past experiences, it's that he chooses not to remember them for the sake of hiding his feelings away. He wishes to go to a boarding school, yet he couldn't really remember why because he chose to suppress this cruel memory. He was in foster care as life got in the way of his academic success. Emphasizing his pain is also considered pathos because it makes the audience feel the desperation and sadness through his words and story. Gladwell uses many techniques that keep the audience engaged and intrigued despite the length of the podcast. Carlos Doesn't Remember is an insightful masterpiece that shows the truth behind the complications of America's education system. Thanks to Basic on SoundCloud for the use of the song Epilogue.